In this video, we'll look at Reagan's economic philosophy and how he handled the economy. Reagan's economic agenda became known as Reaganomics. It combined a belief in tax cuts and deregulation. This would stimulate business, which would create more jobs, Reagan argued. Reaganomics argued that the greatest share of tax cuts should be aimed at businesses and those with higher income, whom, Reagan noted, had paid the greatest share of the taxes under the existing progressive rates. In this way, Reagan reflected what economists called supply-side economics. Now, supply-side economics worked to stimulate the economy by making it easier to make goods. By stimulating production of products directly, prices would drop and more people would in turn buy. Businesses would have more money for research and development and more flexibility in the marketplace. With new and cheaper products, demand would indirectly then increase, ultimately leading to more hiring and higher employment for everybody. At the time, many government policies had operated under the principles of demand-side economics. Now, Democrats had argued that federal policy should focus directly on consumers, augmenting their ability to buy goods. Facing greater demand, businesses would, in turn, need to produce more products and thus hire more people. Democrats looked at supply-side economics and argued that it was a giveaway to the richest Americans, and they declared it derisively trickle-down economics. Unregulated, they argued, the tax cuts would they would not be reinvested, but they'd be pocketed by the rich guys. Democrats argued that the lower tax rates in Reaganomics would deprive the government of needed revenue and would lead to greater national debt. The Reagan administration, however, argued that this wouldn't happen, not only because of the cuts to government spending that Reagan advocated, but also because of the so-called Laffer Curve. Named for the economist Arthur Laffer, it suggested that if federal taxes got too high, it actually would lead to lower government revenue, not more. Lower taxes for businesses and the job creators, as they called them, by contrast, would lead, in turn, to more workers paying taxes, and thus, in the end, more federal revenue despite the lower rates. One of the greatest supporters of Reaganomics was David Stockman, who Reagan made the director of the Office of Management and Budget, OMB. Stockman was very influential in implementing Reaganomics, but later on he's going to break with Reagan and declare that his earlier advocacy had been wrong. Reagan quickly got some legislation lowering taxes past Congress and began economics with the Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981. Here he's shown signing it in the fog of the early morning at his ranch in California. The act lowered taxes for businesses, but mainly focused on lowering taxes for individuals, with the greatest tax reductions for those in the wealthiest categories. The tax rate for the wealthiest Americans went from 70% to 50%, and for the lowest bracket from 14% to 11%. The Democratic criticism appeared to carry weight initially when soon after Reagan implemented his policies, the country went into a recession, the 1982-83 recession. In fact, the economic downturn was more related to the higher interest rates that the Federal Reserve Board under Paul Volcker, who had been appointed by Carter, had instituted to curb inflation. Volcker and many economists argued that the nation had to suffer through a period of high unemployment to bring the 1970s inflation down. Regardless, unemployment reached almost 11%, the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. And as a result, Republicans lost effective control of the House of Representatives in the 1982 congressional elections. After the 1982-83 recession passed and inflation rates were declining, the tax cuts kicked in and the economy boomed, and it remained strong throughout Reagan's year. Here you can see a graph showing that the inflation rate was dropping by the years on the bottom, and the gross domestic product was rising. After the recession passed, the unemployment rate dropped significantly. You can see here pointed out by the arrow the Reagan years. In an argument that Republicans would make, median household income rose significantly during the Reagan years. Here you can see median household income in the middle of the arrow, rising from the about 42,000 to about 47,000 in the Reagan years. Not surprisingly, the stock market began a period of steady growth once the recession of 82-83 had passed. Here you see the Dow Jones Industrial Index. Now, this was all great, but it wasn't the full story. Not everything was good. Perhaps a reflection of the fact that Reagan was unable to make sufficient cuts to federal domestic programs, and at the time, he wanted tremendous increases in military spending, which he got. The national debt exploded. Today, while the Laffer Curve remains controversial, most economists dismiss it as incorrect. Some suggest that the cuts were not reinvested in production sufficiently to have the necessary growth in the economy, while Democrats argued that economic growth is based simply on government borrowing. Here you see a graph showing the debt as a percentage of the gross domestic product, a good indicator of the size of the economy. And you can see it went from just above 30% of the size of the economy to almost doubled in the Reagan-Bush years. As another consequence of Reaganomics, the trade deficit exploded during his presidency, and it's remained a persistent problem in the years since. Here you can see the Reagan years pointed out by the arrow. In any event, this concludes the video on Reagan's economic philosophy and Reaganomics.